Hello and welcome to this week's video of My Hero Academia. This week I'm reviewing episode 6 of volume 4 of Vigilantes. You know how this works by now. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section down below and you will be read out in a future video. Whilst you're there, be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell and do all the YouTube stuff that YouTube wanted to do, because YouTube is an increasingly scary place for small broadcasters. Support your local small broadcaster today. It will do them a power of good, and we are very, very close to breaking the 105 subscriber goal. If I break that goal, then I will be reviewing the second My Hero Academia movie, as that is the only one that I've not done a review of yet. Ooh, what a tease. But between then and now, let us get into the review. But just before we get into the positives, just a quick word of warning. I feel terribly sick at the moment. I've got a sore throat coming on. I don't feel well. So if I don't sound as bouncy as I usually do, now you know. With all that said and done, let us actually get into the positives. And I have to say that this was a very action-packed episode with some really great action sequences seen within it. We are getting a little bit more of the stakes set up for us, certainly as far as how certain characters are being developed is concerned. And I think that it's a decent episode for what it is. Though, let us be honest, the episode itself is still focused around the confrontation between Knuckleduster and Bee, which, you know, surprise, surprise, they're on the cover of the volume, and that's pretty much what we've been doing now for the better part of the past few episodes or so. There is a little bit with Crawler and Popstep and the others, though it's only a small slice. I will admit that it is fun for it is, but it's kind of a bit light for my liking. It is nice, again, is enjoyable. We get the bit with Popstep admitting to the crowd that she feels a little bit nervous about doing this gig, about how she usually only does these very short guerrilla performances. You know, she just goes onto a street corner, starts singing a song and dancing for as long as she can do before the police show up and try to boot her off. Like, that old stuff, great, it's cute, it's enjoyable, it makes Popstep a more endearing character than maybe she has been displayed for most of her time on this show, or rather this series thus far. However, I don't have much to say about all the gig stuff because, again, most of the focus is down to the stuff with Knuckleduster and Bee, which is good for what it is, and I'll discuss that shortly. Likewise, the only other stuff that we have to talk about before we get into that is the stuff with Eraserhead and the captured monster villain. I will admit that when I was reading through this, I thought the villain was going to wake up and be a problem, because in the last review that I did of this, I did conclude that the monster guy would start to wake up around the time that Popstep would start singing, and then that would be the thing that wakes him up, and then he fights Popstep, and Popstep is the one that ultimately defeats him. But it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. As I've said it before, I really hope that is going to be the case, that Popstep is the one that's going to ultimately defeat him, because I think that the monster really works as a great metaphor here for her anxiety when it comes to these performances that she does. It would be her literally beating her anxiety and becoming more of the hero and more of the entertainer that she really wants to be. Whether or not that'll actually end up happening or not, I don't know. I hope that it does, but we are starting to get into the latter half of this particular volume, and I'm not entirely sure that we have time for that to happen. If it doesn't happen, well, at least now you know what's going to be discussed as far as the negatives are concerned when we talk about this review, do the volume-long review. This volume, or rather this episode, of course, as I've been saying previously, is all about Knuckleduster and Bee. This is their big confrontation. This is their big fight sequence. As I said earlier on in this review, I think the actual action itself is great and well put together. I think that it's all composed very well. I think the choreography is there. I think the actual panel work of the actual comic itself, or rather the manga itself, is still well made and well put together. Not the best that it has ever been, but given that this is all just in these rather small paperback volumes, which I will admit I'm not a fan of, but that's because I usually read all my kind of comic books and graphic novels or what have you in a hardback volume, but that's a whole other discussion for all of a time. I will admit that as far as the actual mechanics of the fight itself are concerned, it's great and enjoyable. This is, however, on a more deeper level, is the episode that we learn that there's something up with Knuckleduster's wife/Bee's mother. We get a hint of this earlier on when we see her in the hospital, but now it's been given to us that there's a little bit more of a ticking clock element being added here. The suggestion that maybe she's not going to make it through the night, to boil it down to a little bit more of a dramatic thing of it. I will admit I don't think this whole sequence and this fight sequence really needed it, but I will counter that by saying that I do appreciate the attempts to help build the emotional stakes even higher. can feel a little bit forced, but I think that it could work with this. But how well or not it ultimately does succeed with this is how we get into the execution of it. Maybe it will stick the landing and this will be fantastic, and it will make for some really brilliant and emotive scenes. Maybe it won't, you can't really tell until these things are all done. But I will admit that this does add weight to this whole action sequence. It does add an extra sense of peril and an extra need for Knuckleduster to get this done as soon as possible. He can't just spend the rest of the night and into the early morning hunting down Bee. He needs to put an end to all this madness now so that at least things can sort out. Knuckleduster isn't just wanting to stop this because Bee is, or rather is under the control of a villain, and not just because he wants his daughter back, but because he wants a chance to make sure that his wife's final moments end peacefully with her knowing that her daughter is fine. This adds an extra element into all of this that I do appreciate with it. An extra sense of emotional weight and an emotional ticking clock to all of this. We also learn in this episode that Trigger has additional side effects depending on the type of quirk that is being used to enhance. For this particular quirk that is controlling Bee, we learn that as the quirk itself is being used, or rather the trigger is being used, it lessens the grip and control on the actual victim. And as such, more of their personality and their thoughts and feelings, their true thoughts and feelings, start to boil to the surface. And here we end up seeing that by some, I will admit, rather typical teen drama stuff. It's the kind of thing that you all know well, either from your personal life or from stuff you've seen in other pieces of fiction. It's the parents asking, where are you going at this time of night? Your friends are no good, that guy's a bum, that kind of deal. I like the way that it's actually shown within the volume itself. I think that it's a neat little slice, just a series of quick little flashbacks all done in one page. I think that stuff is great. Admittedly, it is your kind of stock teen drama stuff, and the kind of way that ends up linking into her becoming a villain feels... I'll be interested if they explore that a little bit more, because it does feel like an odd way for it all of a sudden just kind of switch. Like, we go from some rather typical teen drama stuff, like I've said, where you're going to this time of night, to all of a sudden meeting someone in a dark alley and then putting a parasite in your head. Like, you know, some teenagers, when they get rebellious, they do a little bit of drinking, they take a few drugs, they might smoke something they're not supposed to, but here Bee gets a bee in her brain. Good gravy. And if we are to look at more superhero punchy, actiony kind of stuff in this volume, we do learn that Bee's quirk seems to have some kind of ability to do some kind of quirk transference. It does the whole jabbing of the monster villain guy from earlier on to take a sample from them, which briefly gives Bee the electric power, which he then uses to knock out Knuckleduster. Which is neat, it's an interesting twist of things, even though this does feel like we are setting up rather heavily for this is the low point where things are going to go wrong. I think it's fair to say that Knuckleduster is probably going to win out in the end. It's just a question as to how we get there and how squishy and gross and nasty it's going to end up being. Because if Bee really does have a bee in her brain... I don't even want to think about that. I will say that just briefly, whilst we are talking about other positive things I did like, I do just love how vicious a monstrous Bee looks as this particular episode goes along. She just looks increasingly like this wild animal. I'd say like a woman possessed, but, you know, she technically is just that. There's this vicious, feral quality to her, which is shown within the artwork. This twisted desperation of her trying to hold on to this young girl that she has possessed, to try and maintain some kind of control of her and find some way of defeating Knuckleduster and pushing as many emotional buttons as she can do. Like the whole thing about the trigger not really being compatible with her quirk and making her lose a little bit more control also opens up the door for the fact that she can push the emotional buttons even more. She can dig into the memories and thoughts and feelings of the woman that she's possessed, which is nasty and horrible, but hey, it works for a battle like this. It works for a confrontation like this. And I will just say, as more of a personal side note, I am happy that ultimately this big confrontation between these two characters ultimately is just boiling down to a brawl in a back alley, which is something I'm perfectly fine with. I'd rather have the big superhero confrontation fights just being on this scale, rather the whole epic city-destroying, planet-destroying stuff that you get in a lot of other similar kind of fiction these days. With all that said and done, I think it's a good time to get into the negatives, and without repeating what I said in previous issues about Popstep feeling sidelined in what, for the most part, feels like it should be more of her time to shine, I will say that I have an issue with the pacing with this particular episode. I think that it goes a little bit too quickly for my liking. But with that said, it does make sense that it's going as quickly as it has been, because it's almost exclusively action-paced, and these action sequences, whilst they are brilliantly well drawn and put together, whilst the choreography and direction of them is great, it's pretty bloody quick to read through an action sequence in a comic book or a manga or whatever visual medium that you're looking in it. It only takes a few seconds to get through it. However, given that these episodes seem to have a very strict length to them, it feels like not really that much happens. Even though a lot has happened, and if the pacing of it is the worst thing I can say about this episode, it goes on to say that this is a pretty decent episode for what that is. With all that said, let's get into the overview and say that I did enjoy this episode quite a lot. I really enjoyed the fact that even within the action sequences that we do get within this episode, we do get a better insight into Knuckleduster and Bee and their backstory and more of their relationship, and get more of a hint as to how Bee became what she is. I will appreciate a little bit more if we get more of an insight into that, which I'm sure that we'll get in the next few episodes or so, because there is that slight jump in logic that we go from typical teen drama stuff of where you're going at this time of night to all of a sudden someone luring her down a dark alley and putting a bee in her brain. And why specifically her as well is another question that I'd like to find out, but I'm sure it's one that we'll find out shortly. As a whole entity, I think it's a great episode, but it does feel far shorter than it should do, because let's face it, most of the runtime is action sequence. Nothing wrong with that, but it's one of those things where it kind of feels like, it does feel like I'm spending my money on something that doesn't really last quite as long as it should do. But anyway, with all that said, let us get into Comment Corner! Now it's time for Comment Corner. Now all the comments in this particular section will be coming from the review of the Vigilantes episode Daughter. That is because the previous two episodes were specials. We had the Christmas special and the kind of impromptu New Year special, because I didn't realise that episode had anything to do with New Year. So here we are with the comments from that particular video from a couple of weeks back. We're going to start out with Big X1, who says, "This one got off to a great start, but I want to see more with Bee and Knuckleduster though. Thank you for your comment," and we actually got a little bit more of that this week, and something that I can appreciate, though I wish there was a little bit more here. We're getting a nice taste and a nice sampling of things to come, which is something I really want to see more of. The action stuff, like I say, is great, but I want something a little more substantial to go with that. Next up, we have Taken Name, who says, "Queen Bee is the quirk of an animal, in which they use a human as a body in the same way in which Monster Cat Quirk was used a bus in episode 17. Apologies, I screwed up towards the end of it, but I'm not feeling very well. But thank you for your comment. This is something that actually does get hinted upon and explained within the episode itself. I was admittedly in a little bit two minds whether or not to talk about Taken Name's comment, because he felt a little bit spoilery. But hey, given what's said in this particular episode, it pretty much says exactly just that. This is the quirk of someone else, or it's the quirk of an animal or mixture of the two. Given just how weird, wild, and crazy the My Hero Academia superhero world can actually be. We'll see actually how all this comes together, and I will admit that, as I mentioned in the comments that I made to Take a Name a few weeks ago, is that this is stuff I did know about in advance, because as is the case with so many programs, so many shows, so many pieces of media that I really like, I just find myself being a magnet for spoilers. Doesn't matter what it is, I'm just a magnet for spoilers, unless the show's really old or rather obscure and people are just sick of talking about it. I'm not going to mention the other shows that I've been watching recently, because I don't want people to spoil them, bearing in mind I'm just about to get into the final episode of them. With all that said, thank you all for listening, thank you all for watching. Apologise for being low energy and slightly out of it towards the end of this video. I'm not feeling very well. I won't go into details what it was. I'm not in a good way at the moment. Hopefully I should be feeling better by the next episode, but between then and now, thank you all for listening, and see you next time. Goodbye! Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell, and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do. Go on, it'll do me a power of good. Until next time, my friends, goodbye!